What if I told you that one Twilight Zone episode was muted, buried, and wiped out from television history for more than 50 years? It's finally being rescreened after a long 55-year hiatus. However, why was it initially prohibited? Why was it so risky? And why is it more important now than it has ever been? We're entering a realm of terror, redemption, and censorship today. Stranger Than Fiction is a true story. The Twilight Zone welcomes you. A show ahead of its time, Section 1. One Twilight Zone episode aired once in 1964 before disappearing. For more than 55 years, it was kept out of syndication, out of the public eye, and silently removed from the history of the show. Why? What was so hazardous about that episode that it should never be shown again? And why is it being revived at this time? In 2025, we must return to the beginning in order to comprehend that. In contrast to other television shows, The Twilight Zone did not have a recurrent cast or a linear plot when it debuted on CBS on October 2, 1959. Anthology was the title. A fresh story, a fresh cast of characters, and a fresh plunge into the bizarre, the hypothetical, and the ethically difficult every week. They were all united by a spooky low voice. Rod Serling, who narrated every terrifying turn beginning with Episode 2 and authored or co-wrote 92 of the 156 episodes of the show. He spoke clearly and calmly, yet there was always a caution below the serenity. America was experiencing post-war wealth at the time of the play, but it was also privately terrified of nuclear destruction, communist infiltration, and civil unrest. As a veteran of World War II who had witnessed actual tragedy, Serling had no interest in escape. His narratives drew readers into tales that explored injustice, shame, dread, and the unknown. He was aware that people were afraid of themselves as much as they were of monsters or aliens, and he utilized that anxiety to ask, what kind of world are we building, rather than to control. In it, who gets to live? Who is deleted? In numerous episodes, the Cold War was a major theme. Thus did the arms race, the Red Scare, McCarthyism, and the lingering issue of whether humanity was worthy of enduring. After surviving a nuclear apocalypse, a bookworm loses his spectacles and becomes illiterate in the well-known episode Time Enough at Last. When confronted with a nuclear crisis, suburban buddies in the shelter quickly turn against one another. These were not merely warning stories. Reflections of the world around him, they were wrapped in science fiction to evade those who would otherwise put an end to them. That was the Twilight Zone's genius. Serling employed speculative fiction as a sort of shield, including tales about time travel, robots, aliens, and parallel universes. He made statements that were not possible in a simple drama. If the story took place on Mars, network censors were more forgiving, even if Alabama racism was the true issue. If the true focus was on authoritarianism and control, sponsors were less likely to object to a mutant youngster running a community. His use of futuristic packaging to cover up genuine societal criticisms was effective for a while, but not always. Frustration had characterized Serling's previous career. He wrote the live television play Noon on Doomsday in 1956, intended to show Emmett Till's death, but it was so severely sanitized that it lost any significance. In order to avoid criticism from Southern affiliates and sponsors, network officials recast the victim as an anonymous foreigner rather than a black youngster in Mississippi. Serling was enraged. He used the Twilight Zone as a means of regaining authority. Serling had limitations, though. Even amid the Twilight Zone's relative independence, his tone became more political, which alarmed CBS. Sponsors occasionally left in the middle of the season, and ratings were never very strong. The episode that went over the invisible line then came. The Encounter was its name. The episode, which aired just once in May 1964, featured George Takei as a young, pre-Star Trek Japanese-American man and Neville Brand as a resentful World War II veteran. The episode concludes violently, and the entire tale takes place in a single room. It's not comfy. Intense and looking back, masterfully written. However, CBS was inundated with complaints at the time. While Asian American organizations denounced the implication that Takei's father was a traitor, viewers deemed it disrespectful and dangerous. The nation was ill-prepared to deal with its own wartime behavior. The program was taken out of syndication by CBS. The encounter disappeared from public memory, cable, and DVDs for decades. However, why now? Why will this episode be permitted to re-air after 55 years? That is the tale we will now examine, because the answer isn't limited to a single TV show. It's about censorship, history, memory, and the protracted struggle to reintroduce difficult realities. So, they attempted to conceal the episode The Encounter in Section 2. This episode was absent for more than 50 years, nor forgotten, nor lost, interred. Home releases omitted it, executives removed it from reruns, and even ardent fans were kept in the dark. However, The Encounter has returned in one of the most surprising developments in recent media history. Not a remake, not a clean version. The long-banned, unedited original episode was ultimately broadcast again in its entirety in 2016 and will now be available to the general public again in 2025. How could a Twilight Zone episode, which was based on hard realities and moral pain, be too contentious, even by its own standards? What specifically went wrong right in this silent 25-minute bottle episode that was taken out of circulation for 55 years? Let's begin with the fundamentals. On May 1, 1964, during the fifth and last season of the program, The Encounter was broadcast. The Twilight Zone, a television phrase for a story that is told exclusively in one small space with a relatively small cast, usually to save money, produced only 4 bottle episodes in its history. The Encounter, however, offers one of the series' most gripping, socially explosive, and psychologically complex stories in spite of its simple setting. The attic is where it opens. Fenton, portrayed by Neville Brand, is a World War II veteran who is going through old trash. He finds a samurai sword that was obviously taken from a Japanese soldier. Shortly after, a young Japanese-American guy called Arthur, who was portrayed by George Takei in one of his first television segments, enters the attic in search of employment. The two strike up a conversation that initially seems informal, even friendly, as Fenton offers him a beverage. It's not just a conversation between strangers, though. A slow-motion explosion of trauma, remorse, and repressed anger takes place. Fenton begins to reflect about the war, his experiences murdering Japanese soldiers, and how he came to possess that sword. Something is wrong, despite Arthur's best efforts to maintain harmony. He gives the sword too much attention. He speaks in oddly intense repetitions. Then he makes the first shocking revelation. Taro is his real name. Additionally, his father allegedly assisted in the planning of the Pearl Harbor assault while working as a spy for Imperial Japan. The air tightens like a noose from this point forward. Fenton starts to get suspicious. His actions during the war are not the only thing that haunts him. He starts to think Arthur is coming to exact retribution. Meanwhile, Arthur becomes more erratic. He implies that the sword has a spirit and desires blood. There is just no monster, ghost, or alien present. So, 2 guys who have been engaged in psychological combat for decades are imprisoned in a room and unwilling to escape. What, then, caused such a strong reaction to this episode? It may appear clear at first glance. By portraying Arthur's father as a traitor, CBS and its sponsors feared offending viewers, particularly Asian American viewers. This wasn't a casual remark. It served as a major plot point. It suggested that one of the Japanese Americans residing in the United States had contributed to the most catastrophic military assault on the nation in contemporary history. In 1964, when the U.S. government had only started to recognize the extent of its own atrocities against Japanese Americans during World War II, this was being televised. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, more than 120,000 individuals of Japanese descent, the most of whom were U.S. citizens, were taken by force from their homes and interned in camps. These were not combatants of the enemy. Due to their race, these families, teachers, children, and shopkeepers were all imprisoned. There was never any proof of widespread disloyalty or espionage, despite the government's nebulous national security justifications for the incarceration. Furthermore, that reality was still not entirely accepted in 1964. It was deemed provocative and even dangerous to broadcast an episode in which a Japanese-American character affirms that his father was a spy. However, the censors and critics failed to recognize or perhaps chose not to recognize that the interaction was more than a simple case of scapegoating. It dealt with complicity and the lingering effects of conflict. The white veteran Fenton isn't presented as a hero of distinction. He is obviously overwhelmed with shame, unstable, and perhaps dangerous. He acknowledges that he may have slain an unarmed soldier in cold blood and kept the sword as a memento. Not only is the war haunting him, but so is the person the conflict made him into. Arthur is also not an obvious victim. There is a lot of uncertainty in his confession regarding his father. Is it accurate? Was that something he heard as a kid and believed? Is he attempting to convey what it's like to grow up in a nation that imprisoned you behind barbed wire and then taught you to be thankful? Or is he presenting Fenton with a literal or metaphorical truth? Even the sword, which Arthur says is a spirit, might be seen as a representation of the violence that is passed down through the generations, or as a supernatural force. The issue was that none of this was stated explicitly. The episode provided neither moral clarity nor simple solutions. The incident made everyone, including CBS, uneasy at a time when television favored definite heroes and villains. Complaints from viewers came in right away. Sponsors threatened to withdraw their backing. The episode was deemed racist by some. It was anti-American, according to some. Others claimed that it was overly dramatic for prime time. CBS execs were in a panic on the inside. Show was already in trouble because of dwindling viewership and growing production expenses. They discreetly removed the interaction from syndication rather than defending the show or Serling's right to explore limits. The encounter vanished when the Twilight Zone moved into home video, TV marathons, reruns, and eventually streaming. It became into a myth of sorts. Grainy VHS bootlegs were circulated by fans. Some thought it was destroyed. Others believed that the situation had been overblown. Even though he had been interned as a youngster, George Takei hardly ever discussed it until Bodine decades later, when he became a vocal supporter of historical memory and civil rights. Then, in 2016, a change occurred. An unexpected announcement was made by Sci-Fi Channel, which had purchased the rights to broadcast a complete Twilight Zone marathon on New Year's Eve. It would be the first time the duel has been broadcast since 1964. Just the original episode was added to the broadcast as if it had never been there. No modifications or disclaimers. The reaction was instantaneous. Longtime admirers were taken aback. The episode's rawness shocked younger viewers, many of whom had never heard of it. Its honesty was commended by several. It was nevertheless unsettling to some. However, nearly everyone concurred. Among the series' most impactful tales to date was this one. Section 3. What makes the encounter relevant today? Why does a 1964 episode still have such a strong emotional impact today? Why does a single-act scene involving a quiet two-character drama feel more emotionally risky than full seasons of contemporary prestige television? The solution is found in what the episode forces us to acknowledge about ourselves as well as in what it depicts. Due to the fact that this tale is about a topic we're still dealing with, despite being presented in the visual language of a mid-century television play. The lingering effects of war, the shortcomings of historical memory, and the way that individual and community guilt are inherited like family heirlooms. Few viewers were aware that George Takei had actually gone through what his character was referring to when the encounter first aired. Note, after the Pearl Harbor assault, the U.S. government established several internment camps, including the Roa Relocation Center in Arkansas, where he and his family were removed from their home as children. They had done nothing wrong. They received no charges. No trial was ever held for them. The fact that they were Japanese Americans led to their imprisonment. Soldiers showed up at Takei's door when he was 5 years old. Since then, he has discussed what it was like to endure that form of officially sanctioned injustice. Seeing your family lose their house, your parents lose their employment, and being called an enemy based only on your ethnicity. As a child, he recalled guards brandishing firearms at him. He recalled his father's efforts to keep him from knowing the truth. His politics were shaped by that event in addition to his identification. George Takei turned into a vocal supporter of civil rights, homosexual rights, particularly to preserve the legacy of incarceration. And that adds to the complexity of his participation in the interaction. Take's character in the episode confesses something horrifying in addition to remembering his imprisonment, that he had a spy father, that he was involved in Pearl Harbor planning, that perhaps, just possibly, the incarceration wasn't totally unwarranted. The damage is done whether or not we believe him. The persona ends up serving as a metaphor for a sort of inherited betrayal, a racialized guilt that is irreversible. The flip side of the coin is Fenton, the white veteran who murdered during the conflict, may have committed war crimes and took a sword as a memento of his demise. Violence has shaped both guys. It traps them both. This is the most perilous part of Serling's writing. He declines to provide us with a villain. Rather, it presents us with two guys who are both aggressors and victims. Despite coming from a family that had been brutalized by his own nation, Arthur's resentment drives him to commit himself. Fenton is a soldier who is troubled by his experiences abroad, yet he cannot find peace because of his prejudice and paranoia. The audience cannot occupy a position that is safe. It is impossible to support one without acknowledging the shortcomings of the other. The whole point is that ambiguity. Rod Serling was a genius at telling storylines that left the audience feeling conflicted. He addressed racism, nuclear war, and authoritarianism in other episodes, but always with a moral slant that defied simple assessment. He went further with The Meeting. He established an environment in which racial anxiety, national humiliation, and combat trauma blended together without obvious boundaries. This explains why the 1964 episode was so difficult to watch. And for that reason, it is still important today. In actuality, our world now is not all that different. Anti-Asian hate crimes have been on the rise in recent years, particularly during the COVID-19 outbreak. Asian American citizens in the U.S. have experienced harassment, abuse, and criticism just for being seen as foreign. American-born and raised people have been ordered to return to China. On subways, women have been attacked. Older men have been killed and pushed to the ground. Furthermore, fear and false information have been used to defend that hatred just as they were during World War II. The experience doesn't seem out of date in such situation. It is uncannily familiar. Arthur and Fenton's relationship is more than merely a historical one. It serves as a model for how racial trauma functions in the contemporary world. Arthur's internalized shame reflects the guilt and rage that many oppressed people are compelled to carry, while Fenton's paranoia reflects the mistrust that many Americans still harbor toward immigrants or those they perceive. Not only because to what transpired, but also because of the way they are instructed to feel about it. Strangely, the attic starts to represent a broader national attic, which is full with things we haven't dealt with, things we've put away, and things that unexpectedly resurface. And then there's the apologizing issue. It wasn't until 1988, more than 40 years after the incarceration of Japanese Americans, that the U.S. government issued an official apology. President Ronald Reagan's signing of the Civil Liberties Act served as that apology, admitting that the incarceration was motivated by racial prejudice, war panic, and a lack of political leadership. Although survivors received symbolic compensation, the trauma is still not erased by a signature on paper. It continues to recur in various forms despite this. Because it dramatizes something that history books find difficult to explain, the encounter is still significant today. How it feels to be permanently impacted by violence, to be unable to leave it, and to find oneself acting it out even when you try to get away. There is more to the sword in the attic than just a weapon. It alludes to hereditary harm. Fenton is not the only owner of it. Both of them are. Additionally, the attic has turned into a sort of purgatory at the end of the episode. A place where grief, retaliation, and accountability never stop circling one another. That's our current world, isn't it? One where individuals continue to quarrel about who gets to define guilt, who gets to tell the story, and who gets to be the victim. Serling was well ahead of his time in realizing that trauma is not time-sensitive. It is not neatly resolved. It persists, transforms, contaminates connections, and changes identities. Additionally, it contaminates everything unless it is exposed. The encounter's return is crucial for this reason, because it's more than just an episode that was banned becoming unbanned. It serves as a reminder of the power of storytelling when it isn't scared to offend. It demonstrates what occurs when we allow complexity to be reflected in art rather than flattened out. It challenges us to examine our worst impulses and observe their origins. Other missing episodes: The Long Shadow of Censorship and Section 4. When entire episodes of a television program vanish, what does that say about it? They were deemed too complex to display again, not because they were badly constructed. It's difficult to deal with, but not in an overtly disrespectful or scandalous manner. If the encounter was the most well-known Twilight Zone episode to be buried, it wasn't the only one. Several episodes were either forgotten, withheld from home video, or pulled from syndication over the years, because they were too close to something America wasn't prepared to confront, not because they were failures. Making the Twilight Zone suitable for widespread re-airing was the aim when it entered syndication in the 1960s and 1970s. This required removing episodes that gave rise to legal issues, made station managers uneasy, or upset sponsors. Specifically, the original syndication package omitted 5 programs. The Encounter was one of them. The others were An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, Sounds and Silences, Miniature, and A Brief Drink from a Certain Fountain. Although each was eliminated for a different reason, taken as a whole, they depict a media landscape in which the limits of what constitutes appropriate storytelling were frequently arbitrary and continuously changing. A teenage Robert Duvall starred in the creepy film Miniature, which told the tale of a lonely man who gets fixated on a little dollhouse at a museum and starts to think the figures inside are real. A copyright issue resulted to the episode's removal from syndication shortly after it aired in 1963. The episode was licensed for a single broadcast by the estate of author Charles Beaumont, but asserted that CBS failed to get the appropriate long-term rights. Consequently, although Tiny was warmly appreciated when it was first released, it was absent from rerun packages for decades. Only after rights difficulties were settled and it was added to a DVD box set in the early 2000s was it restored. Its content is diminished by the length of time this subdued psychological drama about alienation remained unavailable. Much more regarding the precarious state of creative ownership in early television. Then, in December 1963, there was A Short Drink from a Certain Fountain. The narrative centers on a muffled, middle-aged guy who is coerced into consuming an experimental rejuvenation serum by his much younger wife. It's too effective. His wife is forced into a role she never requested as the man regresses into childhood. Due to legal concerns, the program was taken out of syndication for years. Although the specifics of the argument are yet unknown, some reports indicate that the plot was too similar to an unproduced script that was authored by someone else, perhaps leading to plagiarism accusations. CBS chose to completely remove it from rotation, rather than run the danger of being sued. The instance of Sounds and Silences was more straightforward. The episode centers on a man who has a loud noise obsession and eventually has a mental collapse after starting to hear everything at unbearable volume. Despite its usual Twilight Zone exaggeration, the narrative reflects real-life situations such as hyperacusis, a disorder characterized by high sensitivity to sound. A former Navy man filed a lawsuit against CBS after the show aired, alleging that the plot was based on his life without his knowledge and defamed him. The network removed the show from reruns in order to prevent more legal complications. Only years later, without an official apology or explanation, was it subtly reintroduced on domestic media. Lastly, something happens at Owl Creek Bridge. Serling and his colleagues did not write this episode in contrast to the others. Actually, Robert Enrico's French short film was based on the same titled short tale by Ambrose Bierce. In 1964, CBS acquired the rights to show the movie as a special episode of The Twilight Zone. It was an audacious move. A foreign production inserted into an American sci-fi anthology series without any narration or fresh footage. In the episode, a Confederate sympathizer who is going to be hanged appears to flee and run for his life, but the entire escape is shown to have been a hallucination. In the last moments of life, even though it won an Academy Award for Best Short Film and had a significant impact, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge was only shown once. CBS was permitted to air the show once under the terms of the licensing deal. For years after that, it was no longer in use, and many fans were unaware of its existence. Eventually, it made a comeback in a few home video editions, but unlike other episodes, its peculiar distribution history prevented it from becoming ingrained in the cultural memory. There is more than just a legal or contractual issue that connects these missing episodes. It's the more general problem of control. Who chooses which tales are remembered, which legends are buried, and by whom? Rod Serling spent years fighting these battles. He was worn out by the frequent rewriting, softening, and removal of political overtones from scripts in order to get them through sponsor approval. He previously said that the skill of self-censorship had taken over his work as a writer. That wasn't a joking line. Serling recognized that straightforward attacks would not hold up, so he had to continuously come up with ways to disguise criticisms of racism, Nazism, or xenophobia as space expeditions or ghost stories. As a result, the series was constantly on the brink of disaster. Serling had more power when the Twilight Zone was broadcasting live, but after the show ended, the episodes switched to a new system. One that has no tolerance for ambiguity and is controlled by local stations, sponsors, and syndication agreements. Liabilities included contentious issues, unsolved ethical disputes, and lawsuits, even if they were unsubstantiated. We are still debating that same issue today. The language is the only thing that has altered. We no longer discuss syndication as much. These days, the focus is on content flags, brand safety, and streaming platforms. However, the primary problem is still the same. Why is a work of art too dangerous to display? Who has the authority to make that decision? Across the political spectrum, discussions about media control and cancel culture have resurfaced in recent years. Some contend that in order to safeguard vulnerable communities, offensive content must be removed. Erasing harmful work, according to some, avoids awkward confrontations. Both can actually be true, and at the heart of that conflict is the Twilight Zone, particularly the episodes that are prohibited or censored. Serling was not brilliant at solving problems. It was in causing viewers to feel uneasy enough to pose more insightful queries. And censorship frequently impedes that process, even when it is done with good intentions. Viewers were denied the opportunity to consider a narrative concerning moral ambiguities and intergenerational pain when the encounter was canceled. We lost a distinctive perspective on psychological fragility when sounds and silences were suppressed. We lost an experimental story that experimented with time and perspective in ways that contemporary shows are only now beginning to match when Owl Creek Bridge was put on hold. Ironically, by today's standards, many of these prohibited episodes aren't particularly harsh. They are reserved, nuanced, and occasionally depressed. However, they pose queries that networks are still reluctant to address. What happens if the adversary resembles your neighbor? What if your hero lacks the heroic qualities? What if justice is more about owning up to your mistakes than it is about winning? There has never truly been a Twilight Zone. It has simply changed. Jordan Peele brought contemporary production value and socially conscious themes to a new audience when he brought the series back to life for CBS All Access in 2019. Despite the conflicting reviews, it brought Serling's legacy back into the spotlight. Author Dan Waters plans to publish a new Twilight Zone comic through Ozidia DUI in 2025, promising unique tales that mirror the creepy moral tone of the series. Unexpectedly, Ben Stiller is currently working on a full-length Twilight Zone movie about a fighter pilot who travels 125 years into the future. There is more to this contemporary revival than nostalgia. The timing is crucial. Stories that combine disturbing realism with moral ambiguity are much sought after by audiences nowadays. The Serling paradigm is used in programs like Severance and Black Mirror. Show off what you know. Just a little bit of distortion, and make viewers face difficult realities. The encounter is no longer written off as being overly contentious in that setting. It is acknowledged as an essential narrative, unvarnished but truthful. Serling's voice is still heard today, not only in reruns but also in the artists who are continuing his work and posing the same challenging queries on new platforms. Thank you for viewing. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you found this enjoyable. For more thrilling content, click the next video.